going on, guys? It's me, Train Man, and welcome back to the Zombie Train, episode 100, and I have the document for this. I can tell you it's 175. Yes. And the question today is about the fate of 3254 by D. Nick Chase. He asked me a little bit of a question. Let me get the specific thing. While I do that, we'll talk about what we're doing today. We're working on the inside of the gorge. This is going to be this episode, this is going to be next episode, and if I'm not done by next episode, probably it's going to be a couple episodes after that, because it has to be done by, not this coming Saturday, but by next Saturday. This is a big episode coming out of the Iron Horseman Chronicles that's going to be called The Heroes of Milford. And the hero of Milford, the man they call Jane. For those of you who know Firefly, that's going to resonate with you. For those of you that don't, it'll resonate with you after the episode. Anyways, let me find this. This was episode 174 this question was asked, so last episode. And also, thank you for the questions. Thank you so much. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Okay, so. Okay. What happened to 3254? Did you change engines after a certain point? Okay, so here's the thing. Here's the first big thing, that the bomb I'm going to drop on you guys right away. So Weibold and I, in the end, had commissioned as our main runner what basically amounted to an armored T1. And this is a T1 without a dash, the Pennsylvania duplex type, so that we could get across the country pretty much in the fastest way possible. And this thing had all the advancements you could think to throw in an engine. However, that was quite late, because that was sort of our own thing, and it was both my prerogative and sort of our agreement that the company as a whole came first before we got to play with stuff. The Enterprise was a great toy, essentially, for us to use to get cross-country and this, that, and the other. It could go quite fast compared to, well, pretty much anything else, although I never pitted it in a race against a train to get cross-country. But it had its limitations, as I've said before. So 3254, we took it, in December of 2012, when the Great Panic was, and we ran it from there into the ground. By the time we got it across the country and to Portland, in order to use their facilities to basically give it a full rebuild, as best we could, it had lost a cylinder head, and that had been reattached a couple of times. It had, I can't remember everything that went wrong with it, but I believe we threw the gear once, and that, we had to stop in the middle of our run and piece that back together, or, recalibrate it and everything, which that was not easy. It got hit by a tree a couple of times. That one of them almost crushed the smokestack completely, and we banged that thing back out. And the headlight got shot repeatedly. I think by the end we didn't have any glass in it by the time we got to Portland, although that was amended later. So that's the tip of the iceberg. What was the other thing? Oh yeah, the stoker, of course, broke down. The automatic stoker broke down fairly quickly into our journey. It seemed like it was on the last legs from the very beginning, and eventually the whole thing caught fire. We were up in the mountains on our way to Portland, going over Marias Pass, and we had a fire in the firebox, and not in the good way. Sorry, we had a fissure develop in the bottom of the firebox, in the fire grate, and this allowed burning coals to pour down into the ash grate, and that weakened the metal down there enough that the stoker actually, which was full of coal but was out of commission, began to open up. The metal split, because it had a lot of, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, because it was the winter, up in the mountains. And so that split, and fire traveled down the length of the stoker, possibly over the period of a couple of days. We don't know. But it was burning, we finally only noticed it when the hole in the fire grate got big enough. We stopped and then realized, hey, the stoker is burning. And then the fire made its way into the tender. And the tender was filled with some pretty hefty chunks of coal at this point. There wasn't a lot of smaller bits, because we had just filled up from a train that obviously these were very, very large pieces comparatively. They were 2 or 3 times the size of a fist. And these were ones that you'd take in and you'd crack it, and you'd break it down a little bit and then get it into the firebox. And the fueling of 3254 throughout its days was not consistent. It was not good for the engine. That much I know, because we would go back and forth from like grilled charcoal to day-old oak trees, or just cut down oak trees. I mean, wood, bituminous, anthracite. Not oil, because we didn't have a burner, but we would coat stuff when we could, just to really get the fire going. And so it was basically a smorgasbord of anything that burned went in the firebox. And that was not good for the engine, of course. But, we were dealing with these pretty big chunks of coal. The coal that was in the stoker was obviously smaller, because it could actually fit in the stoker. But that burned through, and that burned into the tender, and the tender, being full of big chunks of coal with a lot of air gaps, created enough draft. When my Uncle Paul, who was like our head mechanics dude, was underneath the engine up in town of Marias Pass. Hold on, let me grab it. But he was underneath the engine working on, he was checking on the stoker, because we were like, okay, there's something wrong with the fire grate. Obviously there's a hole in the fire grate. This is problem. Can you take a look and see what you can do about it? And obviously there's not a hell of a lot you can do about it. We had to steam down, shovel everything out of the ash grate, and we stayed there for like a week, fixing everything. So he was under there, and he cracked into the thing. He cracked into the stoker, because he realized, hey, this is warm. It's warm, and it shouldn't be warm. And so he opens it up from the bottom, and it came off not difficult. It came off fairly easily. And he's looking at it and going, oh wow, he opens it and a bunch of burning coals fall on the ground. So he ducks out of the way of those, he doesn't get hit, but he was looking at it going, huh, and it makes this whistling noise, and it makes this like suction-y noise, and it's like, well, what's going on? And one of our other crew members, Evie, was standing on the tender at the time, and all of a sudden these flames start shooting up through the gaps in the coal. And it's like, oh hell, and she ducks off of there, and all of a sudden we've got this massive conflagration in the tender, of all things. Thankfully it did not do massive damage to the tender, but we ended up using basically what amounted to a fire extinguisher bomb to put that thing out. It turned into almost a full-blown fire tornado, because it got that much draft and that much fire in such a small space. Anyways, so we got to Portland. Things were a little bit worse for wear, if you couldn't understand. We were in Portland for a little while. We disassembled the engine. Wild showed up in Portland, and we had to move. We had to bail out because it was, New Year's. The messengers showed up, and the Battle of Portland happened soon after. Wild, of course, bailed out in 44-49 to go warn the military that this massive organization was coming down from Seattle, ish. And meanwhile, our resident explorers, pretty much, Oswald and Carolyn, they had managed to get the, with the help of their own expertise over the period of a couple of weeks, they managed to get the Tillamook Bay line passable for their 040. And then they got to the other side, and they used the people that were there to get it passable for Weibald's 18, carrying basically the train of all the stuff out to Tillamook from Portland, including the boiler and, including the gutted husk of 3254 out to Portland. Eventually, 3254 was put back together, and we ran out back east, and it continued to be our engine until... Well, it's a good question as to when we changed. I think when we needed the speed, we actually went with 3713, the Mega Pacific. And that did us fairly well, especially for cross-country, but it didn't quite have the range, and it didn't quite have the power that we needed. Frankly, the Mega Pacific was not an immensely well-designed engine. but that thing was restored. It was put into service between Quonset and Montreal, or well, Toronto actually. Sorry, wrong city. The Toronto Rail Lines. Put into service between those two cities, pretty much, and it did that fairly well. But we eventually took it for use as our locomotive. 3254 sort of did odd jobs around southern New England for a long, long time. And that's kind of where he remained in the end, I don't remember what year it was that we went from him to 3713 as our main sort of runner locomotive. But it was right after the events of a certain story. What was that? It involved us crash landing in the snow. We had those Sparrowhawk biplanes off of the Enterprise, and I couldn't fly, but he could. And that led us to getting stranded at one point, when one of those planes pretty much disintegrated on us. And, yeah. So we went down, 3713 found us. Pretty much by chance. And so that was that. We ended up with 3713 for a little while, as I've said. And then we went over to 5550, which was the armored T1. And, it's not a normal T1. It's a little bit heftier. It's actually got, it's got as many modern advances as you can throw in an engine. It's got, it's got the cap signaling, it's got all the radios, it's got, sat radio, and, it's got the steam from the engine is piped through a generator. It came with a tender and an oxy, and those were, I think, perma-coupled, because the oxy would use steam piped in from the boiler to run some pretty hefty turbine generators. And this thing, because of that, was then had to generate more steam than a normal bog standard T1, as well as the fact that it was heavier because it was plated so that the boiler was, more than bulletproof. You could hit it with an RPG and kill it, but, you could unload to it, and you'd probably, your average MG, an AK-47, wouldn't have anything on it. Or, an AR-15, perhaps. Again, it's not like we had a lot of foreign weapons hanging around, but AK-47s run, they don't die. They don't die. And as such, you would see quite a few of them. Anyways, yeah, so 3054 kind of lived on and became just a southern New England engine. Wasn't the zombie train engine, but when we got the chance, he was immortalized down in Quonset and just sort of became the runner out of Quonset, which is where we used a lot of or where we were based a lot of the time, Quonset Point, Rhode Island. With good reason. It was a very nice big deep water port. And even though we couldn't get the taller sailing ships in there, it had plenty of room, basically. Excuse me. Plenty of room to get to expand, with engine facilities and things like that. It had a very large airfield. We were able to build a mooring mast over there. And, things were all well and good, and that Blount would run to Boston, he'd run to Providence, to New Haven, and even when it was finally necessary, or when it was finally prudent to do so, back to New York City. And so, a tangential topic to this, what I'll talk about next time perhaps, is 18. Now, Weibald's engine 18 had a much more interesting life than mine did, because we didn't make any heavy modifications to Blount. He, however, went completely the opposite direction, and I believe, if I recall correctly, he rebuilt it into a completely new engine. So, we'll talk about that next time perhaps, and I'll see you guys next week. Keep feeding me the questions, because I love answering them. And Train Man out.